So that inspired me. John, on Borden Mine, what's the next step in terms of truck vehicle electrification beyond 40 ton for larger mines? Is there a path forward?
The next challenge that we're looking to address there is on-road transportation. So we're still moving. We don't have a mill at that facility, so we're still moving. We're going to move the ore from Chapleau to our Porcupine gold mine facility. So that'll be the big thing. So that over the next couple of years, again, that's probably a challenge for just everyone in the room and more generally across the transportation sector, because I think 40% of the emissions nationally may be attached to transportation. So you're talking about 50-ton transport trucks, and we're involved in that discussion and to kind of understand how that could fit into the particular solutions at Borden. Okay. And Emily, how do you see the carbon price direction? We've got this target by 2022 at $50 a ton. That represents about 14 cents a liter when we put it in terms of diesel price. Maybe 15% cost of energy increase. But where is it going? Do you have, from all your studies, you showed a graph that some sees it as up to $140 a ton. What's your thoughts on the direction it's going to take?
Well, I think that it's less about where the actual dollar price goes versus where we see the penetration of having a carbon price. So if we have more emissions trading systems coming into place, and we have more types of ways for companies to offset their carbon, and there's a price on that, and we can start to see a market developing for carbon credits and such, I think that will have some impact in terms of where the actual price of carbon goes. And so I know that's not necessarily helpful as people try to quantify their energy costs, but I think from CDP's perspective, we've been trying to encourage the setting of a carbon price for a number of years now. And when we talk to companies, we say, start somewhere. Start with $1, start with $5. And one of the things that I think we see the best managed companies doing is as they put in place CapEx plans and they evaluate those based on cost, they also factor in some type of carbon price. $5, $50. But just showing and demonstrating that, I think, is really the near-term step. And I can't really speak on the policy side in terms of what politicians will do or policymakers will do. But I think starting somewhere and embracing it is probably the most important part.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And Chris, when we look at the holistic view of all the possibilities of alternative energies for foreign mine, are there any more prevalent technologies or solutions that you think is more appropriate, or it's case-by-case basis?
Yeah, I think I was mentioning earlier, we're trying to balance this innovation where it's going to provide you competitive advantage with a risk aversion. And so for us, really the majority of our mines are getting power generated by hydro. In the cases of our Northern Alaska mine and our mines in Chile, solar and wind are attractive because they're a bit of a known entity to us. We're keeping an eye on all the other developments, but for us, those are the obvious technologies for us when it comes to electricity generation. I mean, we keep an eye on geothermal, we keep an eye on other technologies. If I can say the nut to crack for us, or the curious piece is still the haul trucks. Or, maybe it's different mine design where you don't need haul trucks, you can use conveyors in place. There's a whole different bunch of configurations, but the haul truck piece, we've tried LNG, we're gonna keep looking at LNG, but I think electrification of haul trucks or some alternative low carbon fuel could be a key piece for us. There's just one, sorry, I was just thinking about what Emily was talking about too, as I joke about people hearing enough from me, and then I keep going. I just wanted to mention one of the things about carbon pricing too for us is, I agree, it's part about where it's placed, but carbon pricing runs the risk of actually undermining itself when we have, like that one map I showed, of a patchwork of different carbon prices. So if you have a jurisdiction, like many in Canada, that are producing their products at a low carbon intensity, and they have carbon pricing in place and it adds burden onto them to the point where they can't compete, you're going to see some of that production or that investment shift to other jurisdictions that don't have carbon pricing. Which isn't to say that we shouldn't have carbon pricing, we should absolutely have it, but it needs to be done in a nuanced and a thoughtful way to make sure that we are incentivizing emissions reductions globally and not just penalizing some of the lowest carbon intensity produced products in the world here in Canada so that they can be produced elsewhere in the globe that hasn't stepped up.
Very good point here. So maybe one last question about financing those initiatives. I mean, the technology is there for many different things, and you talk about electrifying the mine, it's CapEx that you have to absorb. Wind and solar is expensive in terms of CapEx, but you pay the fuel ahead of time. How do you view the financing of that, either transforming that in OPEX, like John said, through an IPP, or providing the energy, or you finance it through the mine, particularly if it's a green field, you can sort of put it with the financing of the mine, spending more for the alternative energy. Maybe John on this?
Yeah, I think Chris mentioned COSIA there recently, and we just finished off our part of an application to what's called this supercluster application. So I think that's not where the capital needs to come from, but I think the role that government has to play there, and this is the potential for a $200 million fund over 5 years with 1.5 times that matched by government, or by industry rather. So it's $500 to $600 million going towards innovation and mining. I think that would be roughly about 50 times more than has ever been sort of singly allocated for things like reducing footprint, reducing and making energy more efficient, and GHGs and water and those things that I think most of us would agree that we don't need to compete on. So that, I think, would have a massive impact to driving that kind of evidence base, that we get beyond some of these capital impediments.
Right.
The other comment that I'd make to the financing is sort of taking it up to a company level. And the mining industry has seen some significant deleveraging over the last 5 or 6 years. And on the flip side, on the investors and capital market side, there is a lot of demand for green bonds, for things that are specifically targeted at looking at either new technologies or initiatives that combat climate change. And there are investors who are hungry for this. So, talk to your favorite investment banker and see, what types of different banks are doing different things. But that could be another potential avenue, sort of taking it out from the project level basis and putting it almost at the corporate level.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
Yeah, just I want to touch on what John mentioned too in terms of government support. I think that's going to be really helpful in Canada. And the context for that is in a number of our operations, we don't have a ton of greenhouse gas reduction opportunities that are low cost because we either already have hydropower or we've driven our costs down as much as we can. And so when we start looking at game-changing technologies, step-change technologies that completely switch the fuel that you're using, those are incredibly costly, or not always, they can be, but there's other costs that people don't always think about. I mean, if you want a new fuel, you want to move away from diesel, you have to make sure you've got the infrastructure at your operation to provide that fuel. You got to make sure that your people are trained on that. You need to make sure that this new fuel is being delivered and housed in a safe way. And so those are fairly significant hurdles for a number of mines in Canada, not all across Canada, but in certain jurisdictions. And so having some of that government funding to help de-risk these up front is key. It's not that mining companies aren't interested in trying to solve this. It's that there's a fairly strong history. I mean, the one graph I had up there was going back to 2006. There's not much more we can do around our dryers in terms of fuels without doing a complete swap out of technologies. You need new buildings. It's a longer story. So Yeah, I think government funding can support that, or other innovation funding can support that, especially if we can leverage the dollars.
I think too, at the asset level, you know, there's always a lot of pressure on annual capital expenditure. So, you know, there'll be certain things that'll be planned, and then eventually those will get, you know, looked at again and set aside for another year that may or may not come to fruition. So I think the other thing that we're doing is we're looking at this at a corporate plan. So you have a plan in place that addresses anything that's going to reduce GHGs and have these kinds of longer term impacts. And then even if you artificially put in a corporate subsidy, you say, okay, well, it's not going to hit your capital budget line item, you know, directly. We'll just say this will be offset by 20%, for example. So planning that with the asset, not just, you know, relying on this kind of big corporate talk, but putting it directly in and as a way of really essentially, you know, not forcing the hand, but supporting the hand. Don't rely on the asset, because the asset really makes most of those capital decisions in our company anyways. So how are we going to work to help on that capital risk side?
Okay, very good. And Adrian, I think we're done. So thank you, Chris and Emily and John, for your presentation and the panel review here. Thank you.